Behind the towering walls of a quiet plantation mansion, something unusual was unfolding in the dead of night. While the overseers slept and the candlelight flickered through the long kitchen corridors, a wealthy widow was teaching her enslaved workers a dangerous secret. Not how to farm, not how to cook, but how to transform ordinary herbs into silent weapons. Hemlock, nightshade, foxglove, plants that grew quietly in the fields were becoming instruments of invisible resistance. One drop in the wrong cup could bring down the most powerful master. And while the plantation believed its power was secure, a quiet revolution was beginning, one poison bottle at a time, behind the towering walls of a quiet plantation mansion. Something unusual was unfolding in the dead of night. While the overseers slept and the candlelight flickered through the long kitchen corridors, a wealthy widow was teaching her enslaved workers a dangerous secret: not how to farm, not how to cook, but how to transform ordinary herbs into silent weapons. Hemlock, nightshade, foxglove, plants that grew quietly in the fields were becoming instruments of invisible resistance. One drop in the wrong cup could bring down the most powerful master. And while the plantation believed its power was secure, a quiet revolution was beginning, one poison bottle at a time. Before we begin the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. And if you enjoy dark untold history like this, make sure you subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and never miss another chilling story. In the early decades of the 19th century, deep in the rural South, surrounded by endless cotton fields and thick forests, stood one of the most imposing estates in the region, Ashwood Plantation. From a distance, the mansion looked peaceful, almost elegant. Its white columns rose high above the ground, and its long wooden balconies overlooked miles of farmland that seemed to stretch into the horizon. Visitors who arrived during the daytime often admired the beauty of the place. Tall oak trees lined the main road, their branches forming a natural arch above the path. The air smelled of fresh earth and blooming flowers that grew in the carefully arranged gardens surrounding the house. But beneath that beauty lived a reality far darker than most outsiders could imagine. Ashwood Plantation was built on the labor of hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children who worked from sunrise to sunset under the watchful eyes of overseers. Every morning before the first light touched the cotton fields, the workers were already awake, preparing for another day of exhausting labor. The sound of iron bells echoed across the plantation to signal the start of the workday, and lines of weary workers moved slowly toward the fields. Life on Ashwood was harsh. The overseers who controlled the fields ruled through fear and punishment. Whippings were common. Families were separated without warning whenever a plantation owner decided to sell workers to another estate. Children grew up watching their parents endure humiliation and cruelty, learning early that survival required silence and obedience. For decades, the plantation operated like countless others across the region. Wealthy landowners believed their power would last forever, and they rarely questioned the system that allowed them to live comfortably while others suffered. But everything began to change the year Eleanor Whitmore became the new mistress of Ashwood. Eleanor was not born into the world of plantations. Long before she arrived at Ashwood, her life had followed a very different path. She grew up traveling across small towns with her father, a physician who treated patients in rural communities where professional doctors were rare. Her father believed deeply in the power of natural medicine. He spent years studying the healing properties of plants and herbs that grew in forests, fields, and riverbanks. From the time Eleanor was a young girl, she accompanied him on many of his journeys. While other children spent their days playing, Eleanor wandered through woods and gardens with her father, learning to recognize different plants by their leaves, their scent, and even the shape of their roots. Her father taught her something most people never realized. Nature held both life and death. Some plants healed wounds and cured fevers. Others were powerful enough to stop a human heart with only a small dose. Hemlock could slowly paralyze the body. Nightshade could cloud the mind and weaken the heart. Foxglove, when prepared carefully, could be medicine or poison. Eleanor absorbed every lesson with curiosity. Her father believed knowledge should never be feared, only respected. He taught her that understanding nature meant understanding balance, the thin line between healing and harm. Those lessons stayed with her for years. But when Eleanor grew older, her life changed dramatically. She married Charles Whitmore, a wealthy plantation owner who controlled Ashwood Plantation. Charles was older, powerful, and well-respected among the plantation elite. The marriage brought Eleanor into a world of wealth and influence she had never known before. At first, she tried to adapt to her new life. She attended social gatherings with neighboring landowners, hosted dinners in the grand mansion, and learned the customs expected of plantation wives. But it didn't take long for Eleanor to notice something deeply disturbing. The plantation system she had entered was built entirely on human suffering. She witnessed enslaved workers being punished for the smallest mistakes. She saw families torn apart when plantation owners decided to sell people for profit. She heard the cries of workers who had been whipped in the fields for failing to meet impossible quotas. The cruelty shocked her. At first, Eleanor said nothing. Speaking openly against the system would have placed her in direct conflict with her husband and the powerful men who surrounded him, but silence did not mean acceptance. Instead, Eleanor watched carefully. She observed how the plantation functioned. She paid attention to the routines of the overseers, the habits of the workers, and the unspoken rules that governed life on the estate. Years passed, and Eleanor became known among the workers as someone different from the other plantation wives. She sometimes treated sick workers using herbal remedies she had learned from her father. When children suffered fevers or injuries, Eleanor quietly prepared herbal medicines to help them recover. To the overseers, this seemed harmless, but the enslaved workers began noticing something else. Eleanor understood plants in ways most people did not. Then one winter evening, everything changed. Charles Whitmore died suddenly from an illness that doctors could not fully explain. Within weeks, Eleanor became the sole owner of Ashwood Plantation. To the outside world, she appeared to be just another wealthy widow trying to maintain her husband's estate. Neighboring plantation owners visited to offer condolences and advice. They expected Eleanor to continue running Ashwood exactly the way Charles had, but Eleanor had already begun thinking differently. With her husband gone, she now had control over the household and its operations. The overseers still managed the fields, but inside the mansion, Eleanor held authority. And during the quiet nights that followed Charles's death, Eleanor often found herself walking alone through the plantation gardens. The gardens were large and carefully maintained, filled with decorative plants imported from distant places. But beyond the neat rows of flowers lay something else, the wild edge of the forest. That forest held plants most plantation owners ignored. One evening, as Eleanor walked along the tree line, she noticed several familiar leaves growing among the shadows. Belladonna, nightshade, foxglove, plants her father had taught her about many years ago. Powerful plants, dangerous plants. Eleanor knelt beside them and touched the leaves carefully. Memories of her childhood lessons returned instantly. She remembered how her father had shown her the chemical compounds hidden inside those plants. She remembered his warnings about how easily they could be misused. And in that quiet moment beneath the trees, a thought slowly formed in Eleanor's mind. The plantation system depended on power. Overseers carried whips. Masters carried guns. But the people who suffered under them possessed none of those weapons, unless they learned a different kind of power. Eleanor looked again at the plants growing around her. Nature had provided something the masters never considered, a weapon that required no gun, no rebellion, no open violence, just knowledge. That realization stayed with her for days. At first it seemed like a dangerous idea, almost unthinkable. But the more Eleanor reflected on the suffering she had witnessed on the plantation, the more she began to see the possibility hidden inside that knowledge. What if the enslaved workers understood the same secrets she did? What if they learned how plants could change the balance of power? The plantation owners believed themselves untouchable, but they depended on the people they enslaved for everything: food, medicine, labor, service, and suddenly Eleanor realized something profound. The kitchen, the most ordinary room in the mansion, might become the most powerful place on the entire plantation, because in that kitchen, herbs were prepared daily, meals were cooked, drinks were poured, and no plantation owner ever imagined that knowledge could quietly grow there. From that moment forward, Eleanor Whitmore began planning something no plantation mistress had ever attempted before. She would not fight the system openly. She would not lead a rebellion. Instead, she would share knowledge, quietly, carefully, patiently, and if her plan succeeded, the people who had always been considered powerless might finally gain something the masters feared more than rebellion: control. The quiet revolution at Ashwood Plantation was about to begin, and it would start in the most unexpected place imaginable: the kitchen. The quiet revolution that Eleanor Whitmore had begun imagining during her lonely walks through the gardens did not start with dramatic speeches or sudden acts of rebellion. Instead, it began in the most ordinary place inside Ashwood Plantation: the kitchen. The large kitchen at the back of the mansion was always active from early morning until late evening. Fires burned constantly beneath iron pots, wooden tables were covered with vegetables and herbs waiting to be chopped, and the scent of food filled the hallways of the house. For the plantation owners, the kitchen was simply a place where meals appeared as if by magic. But for the enslaved workers who labored there, it was one of the few spaces on the plantation where they could move and speak without constant supervision from overseers in the fields. Eleanor understood this better than anyone. Unlike many plantation mistresses who rarely entered the kitchen, she had always spent time there, especially after her husband's death. The workers had grown accustomed to seeing her quietly observing their work or preparing small herbal remedies for those who were sick or injured. Because of this, the overseers never questioned her presence. They assumed she was simply maintaining the household duties expected of a plantation widow. But Eleanor's purpose was slowly changing. In the weeks after her realization in the garden, she began carefully watching the workers who spent the most time in the kitchen. She paid attention not just to how well they cooked, but to how they observed the world around them. Some workers followed instructions silently and avoided attention. Others seemed curious, thoughtful, and quick to learn. Among them was a young woman named Sarah. Sarah had worked in the kitchen since she was a child. Over the years, she had learned to prepare nearly every dish served in the mansion. But what caught Eleanor's attention was not Sarah's cooking, it was her memory. Sarah could recognize dozens of herbs simply by their smell or appearance. When vegetables arrived from the gardens, she knew immediately which ones were fresh and which had begun to spoil. She remembered instructions perfectly and rarely made mistakes. Eleanor realized something important. Knowledge, especially dangerous knowledge, had to be given carefully. It required someone intelligent enough to understand it, and wise enough to keep it secret. One evening, long after the plantation had fallen quiet and most workers had returned to their quarters, Eleanor asked Sarah to remain in the kitchen after finishing her chores. Sarah hesitated at first, unsure why the mistress wanted to speak with her alone. But Eleanor's voice carried none of the harsh authority that enslaved workers were used to hearing. Instead, it sounded calm, almost curious. When the kitchen was empty, Eleanor placed several leaves on the large wooden table where meals were usually prepared. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the room, making the green shapes of the leaves appear almost mysterious. "Tell me what you see," Eleanor said quietly. Sarah looked down at the leaves. For a moment she remained silent. The request was unusual. Plantation owners rarely asked enslaved workers questions unless they were testing obedience, but Sarah studied the leaves carefully. Then she spoke. "Nightshade," she said. Eleanor felt a small sense of satisfaction. Most people in the region would not have recognized the plant so easily, but Sarah had seen it growing along the edges of the forest. "Do you know what it does?" Eleanor asked. Sarah shook her head slowly. "I was told never to touch it." "That advice was wise," Eleanor replied. "But there is more to understand than simple fear." She explained that nightshade contained a powerful toxin. In very small doses it could cause dizziness or confusion. In larger amounts it could stop the heart completely. Sarah listened carefully. Her expression changed from uncertainty to fascination. No one had ever explained plants to her this way before. For years she had gathered herbs and vegetables simply because she was told to do so. But now Eleanor was revealing something deeper: the hidden properties inside those plants. That night marked the beginning of their lessons. At first, Eleanor taught only the simplest things. She explained how to recognize dangerous plants by the shape of their leaves and berries. She showed Sarah how different parts of a plant could hold different levels of toxicity. Some poisons existed in the roots, others in the flowers, and some in the seeds. But Eleanor also emphasized something important. Knowledge was not the same as action. "Understanding poison does not mean using it," she told Sarah one evening. "It means recognizing power where others see nothing." Sarah nodded, absorbing every word. Over the following weeks, their quiet lessons continued. Each night after the kitchen work was finished, Eleanor would place new plants on the table: hemlock, foxglove, belladonna. Each carried a story and a warning. Eleanor explained how ancient physicians and scholars had studied these plants for centuries. Some had been used as medicine in controlled doses, others had been infamous tools of assassination throughout history. But the most important lesson Eleanor taught was about observation. Plantation owners rarely noticed the plants growing around them. They saw fields, crops, and profit, but not the wild herbs at the edges of the land. Those plants, Eleanor explained, held secrets the masters did not understand. As Sarah's knowledge grew, Eleanor noticed something else. Sarah was beginning to think like a student rather than a servant. She asked questions. She examined plants more closely. She even began recognizing subtle differences between similar leaves. Eleanor realized the time had come for the next step. One evening, Sarah entered the kitchen with someone else beside her, a young man named Daniel who worked as a stable hand. Eleanor looked at Sarah with surprise. "I trust him," Sarah said quietly. Eleanor studied Daniel carefully. Trust was dangerous, but if knowledge was to spread, it could not remain with only one person. Reluctantly, Eleanor allowed Daniel to stay. That night she repeated the same lesson she had first given Sarah. She placed a plant on the table and asked the same question. "Tell me what you see." Daniel hesitated longer than Sarah had, but eventually he answered correctly. The secret classroom had gained its second student. From that moment forward, the lessons slowly expanded. Sarah and Daniel began bringing other trusted workers, people they believed could keep the secret. The kitchen, once simply a place of cooking and labor, was becoming something far more unusual. A hidden school. Eleanor taught them how to prepare plant extracts by crushing leaves and mixing them with water or alcohol. She showed them how certain toxins could be masked by strong flavors in food. She explained how symptoms of poisoning could resemble natural illness if the dosage was small and gradual. The workers listened with a mixture of fear and fascination. For generations they had been told they were powerless. Now they were learning something the masters had never imagined they could possess, scientific knowledge. But Eleanor was careful. She never told them to harm anyone. She simply gave them the information. "What you do with knowledge," she told them one night, "must be your own choice." The lessons continued quietly for months. The overseers never suspected anything unusual. To them, the kitchen workers were simply doing their jobs. They never imagined that inside those walls, something far more dangerous was being created. Understanding, and as Sarah and the others learned more about the plants growing around the plantation, a new realization began spreading among them. The masters controlled the land, they controlled the labor, they controlled the laws, but there was one thing they could never fully control: nature. And hidden within that nature were tools powerful enough to challenge even the most brutal system. The secret classroom at Ashwood Plantation had only just begun, but its lessons would soon reach far beyond the kitchen walls. As the quiet lessons inside the kitchen continued night after night, something subtle but powerful began to grow among the small group of workers who had been invited into Eleanor Whitmore's secret classroom. At first, the knowledge she shared felt almost unbelievable. For their entire lives they had been taught that the world belonged to their masters, that power existed only in whips, guns, and ownership. But now they were discovering something that none of the overseers had ever mentioned, that nature itself carried hidden forces capable of challenging even the strongest men. The kitchen had been the beginning of their education, but Eleanor knew it could not remain the only place where learning happened. The mansion walls were too close, the risk of discovery too high, and the plants she had spoken about did not grow on kitchen shelves alone. The true classroom, she realized, existed beyond the plantation gardens, where wild plants thrived unnoticed along the edges of the forest. One evening, when the moon was high, and most of the plantation had fallen into its usual quiet stillness, Eleanor quietly gathered Sarah, Daniel, and the few others who had begun attending the nightly lessons. She told them to follow her, but not to speak loudly and not to carry any lanterns that might attract attention. The group moved silently through the back corridors of the mansion, past the kitchen doors, and into the cool night air outside. The plantation at night felt like a different world. During the day, the land was filled with the sound of labor, voices shouting across the fields, tools striking the ground, overseers calling out orders. But now the fields were silent. Only the distant chirping of insects and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind could be heard. Eleanor led them past the neatly arranged garden beds that grew vegetables and herbs for the kitchen. These were plants the plantation relied on: corn, beans, squash, rosemary, mint. The overseers paid close attention to these crops because they were valuable, but Eleanor continued walking. Soon the carefully maintained garden ended, and the land began to change. The ground grew uneven, and tall grasses swayed gently in the wind. Trees gathered closer together, forming a natural barrier between the plantation and the deeper forest beyond. Here, the plants were wild, uncontrolled, ignored. Eleanor stopped beside a cluster of dark green leaves growing beneath the shade of an oak tree. She knelt down and brushed away some dirt from the base of the plant. "This," she said quietly, "is where the real lessons begin." Sarah stepped forward and looked closely at the leaves. They were shaped differently from most of the herbs she had seen in the kitchen, darker and thicker, with small berries beginning to form along the stems. "Belladonna," Sarah said slowly, remembering the earlier lessons. Eleanor nodded. "Deadly nightshade," she replied. "Beautiful to look at, but a few berries can silence a man forever." The group exchanged nervous glances. Seeing the plant in the wild made its danger feel more real than when it had been simply leaves placed on a kitchen table. It grew quietly here among the trees, unnoticed by the plantation owners who passed nearby every day. Eleanor stood and began walking deeper along the forest edge. As they followed her, she pointed out different plants growing in the shadows: hemlock growing near a stream bank, foxglove rising tall with its delicate bell-shaped flowers, mandrake hidden among thick underbrush. Each plant carried a story. Eleanor explained how people across the world had discovered their properties centuries earlier. Ancient physicians had studied them, alchemists had experimented with them, and rulers had sometimes used them as silent weapons. But the plantation owners of the South rarely paid attention to such knowledge. Their focus was on crops that made money. Cotton, tobacco, sugar, everything else was considered useless. That ignorance, Eleanor explained, created opportunity. "These plants," she said, gesturing to the forest around them, "have always been here, long before the plantation was built, long before any master claimed this land." Daniel crouched near a tall, flowering plant Eleanor had pointed out earlier. "Foxglove," he said quietly. Eleanor smiled slightly. "Yes," she said, "in small amounts it can help the heart. In larger amounts, it can stop it." The group listened carefully as Eleanor began explaining the more complex aspects of botanical chemistry. She described how certain compounds inside plants affected the human body, how some interfered with the nervous system, how others slowed the heart or weakened the lungs. She explained that poison was rarely about dramatic instant death. More often, it was subtle. A person might feel dizzy, weak, confused. Doctors might assume illness or exhaustion, and that subtlety made plant toxins difficult to detect. The workers absorbed every detail. For people who had spent their lives performing exhausting labor without education, this knowledge felt almost revolutionary. They were not simply learning names of plants. They were learning how the natural world functioned. Sarah felt something shift inside her mind. For the first time, she realized the plantation masters were not the only ones capable of holding knowledge. The lessons continued for several weeks. Whenever the plantation slept, the small group gathered quietly near the forest edge. Each night, Eleanor introduced them to new plants and taught them how to recognize subtle differences between species that looked similar. Some plants were harmless, others were extremely dangerous. She showed them how to identify leaves by their veins, how to smell roots for distinctive scents, and how to test plants carefully without exposing themselves to harm. But the most important lesson Eleanor emphasized repeatedly was caution. "These plants are powerful," she told them, "but power without understanding is dangerous." She insisted they never handle toxins carelessly and never use the knowledge recklessly. At first, the workers believed the lessons were purely educational, but over time, another realization slowly began forming in their minds. If knowledge of plants could heal, it could also protect or even resist. The plantation system had always depended on fear. Overseers believed the enslaved workers had no choice but to obey because they lacked weapons or resources, but now the workers were discovering something hidden within the very land they worked every day. The forest around Ashwood Plantation was filled with possibilities the masters had never imagined. One night, as the group prepared to leave the forest clearing, Daniel turned to Eleanor with a question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "Why are you teaching us this?" he asked. The others looked at her as well. Eleanor paused before answering. Her eyes moved across the faces of the workers standing before her. people who had endured years of cruelty and injustice. "For too long," she said quietly, "power has belonged only to those who believe they deserve it." She looked back toward the distant mansion where plantation owners slept peacefully. "But knowledge," she continued, "can change that." The group remained silent as her words settled in their minds. Eleanor had not ordered them to rebel. She had not asked them to harm anyone, but she had given them something far more powerful than commands: understanding, and understanding had a way of spreading. Over the following months, the secret lessons at the edge of the forest continued growing. Sarah and Daniel began helping teach newer students the basics Eleanor had already shown them. The poison garden, as some of the workers began quietly calling it, had become a place of learning, a place where the oppressed could study forces the masters ignored. And slowly, almost invisibly, something remarkable was happening on Ashwood Plantation. The people who had once believed themselves powerless were beginning to realize that knowledge itself could become a form of resistance. But neither Eleanor nor the workers knew yet how dangerous that knowledge might become once it spread beyond the forest, because secrets rarely remain hidden forever. And the quiet revolution growing among the plants of Ashwood Plantation was about to face its first real test, as the quiet lessons in the poison garden continued to shape the minds of those who attended them. Life across Ashwood Plantation appeared, on the surface, to remain unchanged. The cotton fields still stretched endlessly under the burning sun. Overseers still rode through the rows on horseback, shouting orders and cracking whips to maintain discipline. The mansion still hosted dinners where neighboring plantation owners gathered to discuss profits, harvests, and the price of cotton in distant markets. To anyone looking from the outside, Ashwood remained a typical plantation of its time, orderly, productive, and firmly under control. But beneath that calm surface, something subtle had begun to shift. For the first time in generations, knowledge was quietly spreading among the enslaved workers. The lessons Eleanor Whitmore had begun in the kitchen and expanded into the forest were now reaching more ears, more minds, and more curious observers. Sarah and Daniel, who had become Eleanor's most trusted students, were slowly helping others understand the basics of what they had learned. They did so carefully, always choosing people they believed could be trusted. The risk was enormous. If the overseers discovered what was happening, the punishment would be severe for everyone involved. So the workers were careful. Conversations happened quietly while gathering vegetables from the garden. Questions were asked casually while carrying water from the well. A quick glance at a plant along the forest edge might be followed by a whispered explanation of its properties. The knowledge moved slowly, like the growth of roots beneath the soil. But as with all secrets, the more people who knew about it, the greater the chance that someone might notice something unusual. Inside the mansion, the overseers had begun observing small changes they could not quite explain. At first, the differences seemed insignificant. Kitchen workers appeared more confident when handling herbs and plants. A few of them spent extra time gathering leaves from the forest edge rather than relying only on the garden vegetables provided by the plantation. None of this seemed like a crime, but overseers were trained to notice patterns. One of the plantation's field overseers, a man named Thomas Grady, began paying closer attention to the activities around the mansion. Grady was known across the plantation as a cruel and suspicious man. He believed discipline and fear were the only ways to control enslaved workers, and he trusted no one, not even the other overseers who worked alongside him. Grady had spent years watching the workers closely for signs of rebellion or disobedience. In his mind, enslaved people were always plotting something, always looking for ways to escape or resist. So when he noticed small gatherings among the kitchen staff late at night, his suspicions were immediately triggered. One evening, as he passed near the back of the mansion, he saw faint candlelight glowing through the kitchen window long after the evening meals had been prepared. Curious, he stepped closer and listened. Inside, Eleanor's voice could be heard speaking calmly. The overseer could not hear every word, but he caught fragments of the conversation. "The leaves contain a substance that affects the heart. Too much can slow the body. Always handle carefully." Grady frowned. It sounded like a lesson. But what kind of lesson would a plantation mistress be giving to kitchen workers in the middle of the night? The idea unsettled him. He leaned closer to the window, trying to see inside, but the angle of the light made it difficult. Shadows moved across the walls, and he could make out the shapes of several workers gathered around the large wooden table. Grady's first thought was that Eleanor might simply be teaching them about medicinal herbs. Plantation owners sometimes used home remedies to treat illnesses among workers because it was cheaper than hiring doctors. But something about the tone of the conversation felt different, more serious, more focused. Still, Grady knew better than to accuse the mistress of the plantation without evidence. Eleanor Whitmore was not just another worker. She was the legal owner of Ashwood Plantation. Questioning her actions could easily cost Grady his position, so he decided to wait. Over the next few days, he began watching the kitchen more carefully. Whenever he passed the back corridors of the mansion, he glanced toward the doors and windows, hoping to see something that might confirm his suspicions, but Eleanor and the workers were careful. After that night, the lessons inside the kitchen became less frequent. Instead, the gatherings moved increasingly toward the forest edge where the poison garden had already become their true classroom. From the overseer's perspective, the workers were simply performing their usual duties. Some spent time in the gardens gathering herbs. Others carried baskets toward the forest where wild plants sometimes grew. Nothing appeared openly suspicious, but the whispers inside the mansion were growing. Servants occasionally mentioned seeing Eleanor walking through the gardens at unusual hours. A few workers spoke quietly about how she seemed to know far more about plants than any plantation mistress they had known. Before, rumors began circulating among the overseers. Some believed Eleanor was simply eccentric, a widow passing her time studying herbs and nature. Others were less comfortable with the idea. One evening during dinner in the mansion's main hall, several overseers gathered near the long wooden table where they often ate after the plantation owners finished their meals. Grady leaned forward and spoke quietly to the others. "Have any of you noticed the mistress spending time with the kitchen workers at night?" he asked. One of the overseers shrugged. "She studies herbs," the man replied. "I've seen her mixing medicines for sick workers before." Grady shook his head slowly. "It's more than that," he said. Another overseer laughed dismissively. "You're imagining trouble again, Grady. The mistress owns the plantation. If she wants to teach them about herbs, that's her business." Grady said nothing more, but his suspicion did not disappear. Something about Eleanor's behavior still felt unusual to him. Meanwhile, Eleanor understood that attention from the overseers was becoming a real danger. She had expected this possibility from the beginning. The more knowledge spread among the workers, the greater the chance that someone outside the group would notice, so she adjusted her strategy. The lessons became more subtle. Instead of gathering large groups at once, Eleanor began meeting with smaller groups in different locations. Some nights the meetings took place in the kitchen. Other nights they happened near the garden or deeper within the forest. The workers also became more careful about how they discussed what they had learned. Conversations about poisonous plants were disguised as discussions about medicine or cooking ingredients. To the overseers, it appeared as though Eleanor was simply improving the workers' ability to care for the plantation's herbal garden. But beneath that harmless appearance, the lessons continued growing more advanced. Eleanor now began teaching about preparation techniques. She showed them how certain plants could be dried and ground into powder. Others could be boiled into concentrated extracts. Some toxins worked quickly, while others took hours or even days to affect the body. Understanding timing, she explained, was just as important as understanding dosage. The workers listened with intense concentration. For many of them, this was the first time in their lives that someone had treated them as students capable of learning complex ideas. And the more they learned, the more they began to realize something that had once seemed impossible. The plantation masters were not invincible. They depended on the labor and service of the very people they oppressed, and those people were now gaining knowledge the masters had never bothered to learn. But while the workers were growing more confident, Eleanor remained cautious. She knew the overseers were watching. She knew suspicion could lead to investigation, and investigation could lead to discovery. The quiet revolution at Ashwood Plantation was still fragile. One careless mistake could destroy everything they had built. Yet even with the danger growing around them, the lessons continued, because Eleanor understood something the overseers did not. Knowledge, once shared, could not easily be taken away. And as the whispers inside the mansion spread from worker to worker, the seeds of something powerful were taking root, something that could change the balance of power across the plantation in ways no one had yet imagined. The poison garden had begun as a classroom, but it was slowly becoming something far more dangerous, a symbol of possibility. And sooner or later, that possibility would face its first real test. As the quiet lessons in the poison garden continued to spread through whispers and careful observation, the atmosphere at Ashwood Plantation began to change in ways that were almost impossible for outsiders to notice. On the surface, everything still appeared exactly the same. The cotton harvest continued as usual, overseers still patrolled the fields with their usual harsh authority, and the mansion still hosted the same gatherings of wealthy plantation owners who spoke proudly about their land and profits. But beneath that surface, something different had begun to grow. The enslaved workers who had learned from Eleanor Whitmore were no longer the same people they had been months earlier. The knowledge they carried in their minds had quietly transformed the way they saw the world around them. Plants that once appeared to be simple weeds now held deeper meaning. A leaf, a berry, or a root growing beside the forest path could contain powerful chemical forces hidden from the masters who believed they controlled everything. The poison garden had given them something new, understanding. Yet Eleanor had always warned them that knowledge alone was not enough. Power required patience, discipline, and careful thought. Reckless action could destroy everything they had learned. For many months, the workers followed that advice. The lessons continued quietly in the forest, and no one used the knowledge for anything beyond learning and discussion. The workers simply observed the plants around them and practiced identifying them from a distance. They studied the difference between safe herbs and dangerous toxins. They memorized the ways different plants affected the human body. But tension on the plantation was slowly increasing. One man in particular had become the center of that tension. Thomas Grady, the overseer who had earlier suspected something unusual in the mansion kitchen, had grown even more aggressive in the fields. His cruelty had always been well known among the workers, but in recent months his punishments had become harsher and more frequent. Some believed Grady was simply trying to prove his authority after sensing changes among the workers. Others believed his suspicion of Eleanor's activities had made him more paranoid. Whatever the reason, Grady had begun enforcing discipline with brutal intensity. Workers who slowed down during the heat of the afternoon were whipped without warning. Anyone caught speaking during work hours risked severe punishment. Even small mistakes, dropping a tool or failing to fill a cotton basket quickly enough, could bring violent consequences. Sarah saw the effects of Grady's cruelty almost every day. One afternoon, a young worker named Caleb collapsed from exhaustion while picking cotton. Instead of allowing him to rest, Grady ordered him to stand and continue working. When Caleb struggled to move, the overseer lashed him repeatedly with a whip in front of the entire field. The workers were forced to watch. Sarah stood nearby, holding a basket of harvested cotton, her hands trembling slightly as she witnessed the punishment. She had seen violence before. It was common on plantations, but something inside her had changed since Eleanor began teaching them. Now she understood something Grady did not. Power was not always visible. Later that evening, after the workers returned from the fields, Sarah found Daniel near the edge of the forest, where the poison garden lessons often took place. They stood quietly for several moments before speaking. "You saw what happened today," Sarah said. Daniel nodded slowly. Everyone saw. The memory of Caleb's punishment lingered heavily between them. For months, Eleanor had emphasized patience and restraint. She had never encouraged anyone to use the knowledge they were learning for revenge or violence. But the suffering they witnessed daily made those lessons harder to follow. Daniel crouched down and picked up a small leaf from the ground. "Hemlock grows all around this place," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him sharply. The implication of his words was clear. For the first time since the lessons began, someone was openly considering the possibility of using what they had learned. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Sarah shook her head. "Eleanor said knowledge is power," she replied, "but she also said we must be careful." Daniel stood and looked toward the distant plantation fields where the overseer's cabin stood in the fading light. "How much longer do we watch people suffer?" he asked. Sarah had no answer. That night, during the next gathering in the forest, the tension among the group was impossible to ignore. Several workers spoke quietly about the increasing cruelty in the fields. Others expressed fear that the overseer's suspicion might eventually expose their secret lessons. Eleanor listened carefully as the group shared their concerns. She understood their anger, she understood their pain, but she also understood the danger of acting too quickly. "What we are learning," she told them calmly, "is not meant to create chaos. Knowledge without wisdom can destroy the very people it was meant to protect." She reminded them that any reckless action would lead to severe punishment, not only for the person responsible, but for everyone connected to them. Yet even as she spoke those words, Eleanor could see the change in their faces. The workers were no longer simply students. They were people living under constant oppression, and the knowledge they now possessed had awakened a new awareness of the power they might hold. Over the following weeks, Grady's behavior became even worse. He began searching the workers' quarters more frequently, looking for signs of rebellion. He questioned workers aggressively, demanding to know what they discussed among themselves during evenings. Several people were beaten simply for appearing nervous during his interrogations. One afternoon, Sarah entered the kitchen to find Caleb, the young worker who had collapsed earlier in the fields, barely able to stand. His injuries from the whipping had become infected, and he struggled to breathe from the fever that followed. Eleanor examined his wounds carefully. She prepared herbal medicine to reduce the fever and ease the pain, but as Sarah watched the suffering of the young man lying on the wooden bench, she felt the weight of the knowledge she carried. The poison garden had taught them about plants that could heal, but it had also revealed something else. Some plants could stop cruelty permanently. That evening, Sarah returned to the forest clearing earlier than usual. Daniel was already there, sitting quietly near the base of an old tree. He looked up when she approached. Neither of them needed to speak immediately. They both understood the question that hung between them. After a long silence, Daniel finally said what they had both been thinking. If someone like Grady disappeared, he said carefully, the plantation would change. Sarah looked down at the ground. The idea terrified her, but it also felt strangely logical. The lessons from Eleanor had always emphasized knowledge rather than action. Yet the knowledge itself had already begun changing how the workers saw the world. The masters believed they controlled everything, but the workers now understood that control had limits, because even the most powerful overseer depended on something simple: food, water, trust. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, remembering Eleanor's warning about patience. Then she spoke quietly. "We cannot decide this alone." Daniel nodded. The decision they were considering would affect everyone involved in the secret lessons. It was no longer just about learning. It was about responsibility. For the first time since the poison garden had begun teaching its secrets, the knowledge they carried was approaching its first real test, and once that test began, there would be no easy way to return to the quiet world that existed before. Ashwood Plantation was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something the overseers would never see coming. Because the revolution Eleanor had started with knowledge was slowly reaching the moment when knowledge might finally become action. The quiet conversation between Sarah and Daniel near the edge of the forest marked a turning point in the hidden world that had been growing beneath the surface of Ashwood Plantation. For months, Eleanor Whitmore's lessons had focused on knowledge, understanding the plants, recognizing their properties, and learning how nature could both heal and harm. But until now, the idea of actually using that knowledge had remained distant, almost theoretical. The poison garden had been a place of education, not action, yet the suffering inside the plantation had never stopped. Each passing day brought new reminders of the cruelty that defined life under the overseer's authority. The whippings in the fields continued. Families remained separated. Exhaustion and fear were constant companions for the workers who rose before dawn and labored until darkness covered the land again. And now, with the knowledge Eleanor had shared spreading quietly among them, the workers were beginning to see the plantation through a different lens. For generations, enslaved people had been taught that resistance was impossible. The masters held the weapons, the overseers controlled the land. The laws themselves supported the system that kept the workers trapped, but knowledge had begun to reshape that belief. Nature, they were learning, did not belong to the masters. The plants growing along the forest edge, the roots hidden beneath the soil, and the berries hanging quietly on wild branches answered to no overseer. They carried chemical forces that existed long before plantations were built and would continue long after they were gone. And slowly, that understanding began spreading beyond the small group that had first attended Eleanor's lessons. At first, Sarah and Daniel were extremely careful about who they trusted. They knew that even a single careless word could lead to disaster. If the overseers discovered that workers were studying poisonous plants, the consequences would be brutal. But over time, the need to share the knowledge became stronger. Workers who had witnessed the lessons began teaching small pieces of what they had learned to others they believed were trustworthy. The teachings were never delivered openly. Instead, they appeared in quiet moments, while gathering herbs for the kitchen, while working near the forest edge, or while tending small gardens beside the workers' quarters. "See this leaf?" Sarah might say quietly to someone picking vegetables beside her. "It looks like a common weed," she would explain, "but if you crush it and smell it, you'll notice the bitter scent. That means it belongs to the nightshade family." Little by little, these lessons spread. Some workers began learning how to identify hemlock growing near the water sources. Others learned how foxglove flowers contained powerful compounds that could affect the heart. They also learned caution. Eleanor's warnings were repeated often. These plants were dangerous not only to the masters but also to the people studying them. Handling them without knowledge could easily lead to accidental poisoning, so the workers practiced carefully. They learned to recognize plants without touching them. They studied the shape of leaves and the colors of berries from a distance. They memorized the differences between similar-looking species. For the first time in their lives, many of them felt as though they were learning something complex and meaningful, something that expanded their minds rather than simply exhausting their bodies. Meanwhile, life on the plantation continued, with its usual harsh rhythm. Thomas Grady remained as cruel as ever, though the events of the past weeks had made him even more suspicious. He noticed that the workers had become quieter around him, more cautious in their behavior. To Grady, silence often meant plotting, so he increased his patrols across the plantation, riding through the fields more frequently and questioning workers whenever he sensed something unusual. But even with his watchful eye, the knowledge spreading among the workers remained invisible. It traveled through whispers rather than open gatherings. It appeared in casual conversations rather than formal lessons, and because of this, Grady could not identify any clear threat. One evening, after a long day in the fields, several workers gathered near the small fire pits outside their quarters. These gatherings were common. Workers often sat together to share what little food they had and to talk quietly before sleep. On this particular evening, the conversation turned to illness. One of the older workers, a man named Isaac, spoke about how certain plantation owners in nearby regions had fallen ill recently. Travelers passing through had mentioned strange fevers and sudden heart problems affecting several wealthy landowners. To most people, these stories sounded like ordinary illness. But among the workers who had studied Eleanor's lessons, the stories sparked curiosity. Daniel listened carefully. "What kind of sickness?" he asked. Isaac shrugged. "They say some men suddenly felt weak, others had trouble breathing, doctors couldn't always explain it." Sarah glanced at Daniel across the fire. The symptoms Isaac described sounded familiar: foxglove poisoning, nightshade intoxication, hemlock paralysis. Of course, there was no way to know if those illnesses were truly connected to poison, but the mere possibility stirred something powerful in their minds. Knowledge like the kind Eleanor had shared did not exist only on Ashwood Plantation. Some enslaved people across the South had long traditions of herbal medicine and plant knowledge passed down through generations. It was possible, perhaps even likely, that similar knowledge existed on other plantations as well. The idea that oppressed people across different regions might share hidden understanding created a strange sense of connection. Resistance did not always need to be loud. Sometimes it could move quietly from person to person, just like knowledge. Back at the mansion, Eleanor Whitmore continued observing the changes unfolding around her. She noticed how Sarah and Daniel had begun guiding others carefully. She saw how workers examined plants with curiosity rather than fear. And though she never openly asked what they intended to do with the knowledge they were learning, she understood that its influence was growing. One evening, Sarah approached Eleanor in the kitchen after the other workers had finished their tasks. "The others are learning," Sarah said quietly. Eleanor looked up from the herbs she was preparing. "Learning is good," she replied. "But they are also asking questions," Sarah continued. "Questions about what this knowledge means." Eleanor paused for a moment before answering. "That is natural," she said. "Knowledge always leads to questions." Sarah hesitated. "What if they decide to use it?" she asked. Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "That decision must belong to them," she said. The answer surprised Sarah. "You won't stop them?" she asked. Eleanor sighed softly. "I cannot control how knowledge changes people," she explained. "Once someone understands the world differently, their choices become their own." Sarah thought about that for a long time. The poison garden had begun as a place of learning, but it had already grown into something more. It had changed how the workers saw themselves. And as the knowledge continued spreading quietly through Ashwood Plantation, and perhaps even beyond it, something else began to spread as well. Confidence. For the first time, the master's power no longer seemed absolute, because the workers understood a truth that had been hidden from them for generations. The masters depended on the people they enslaved for everything: food, medicine, labor. And that dependence meant vulnerability. The quiet revolution Eleanor Whitmore had started was no longer confined to a small group of students in a forest clearing. It was moving through the plantation like an unseen current, flowing from mind to mind. And although the overseers still believed they held complete control over Ashwood, the balance of power had already begun shifting in ways they could not yet see. The knowledge had taken root, and once knowledge spreads among those who have long been denied it, the world that once seemed unchangeable can begin to transform in the most unexpected ways. As the quiet spread of knowledge continued across Ashwood Plantation, something deeper began to take shape, something that could not be easily seen, measured, or controlled. It was not rebellion in the traditional sense. There were no loud protests, no armed uprisings, and no open defiance that would immediately draw the attention of the overseers. Instead, the change moved like a whisper carried through the night air. It lived in the minds of the workers. The lessons from the poison garden had already given many of them a new understanding of the natural world, but more importantly, it had given them a different way of seeing the plantation itself. For generations, the enslaved had been taught that the system surrounding them was unbreakable, that the masters held absolute authority over every aspect of their lives. But knowledge had quietly broken that illusion. Now, when workers moved through the fields, they did not only see rows of cotton and the watchful eyes of overseers. They also noticed the plants growing along the fence lines. They observed the wild herbs creeping through patches of shade. They recognized leaves and berries that once meant nothing to them. Every part of the land had begun to reveal hidden possibilities. Sarah often found herself noticing these small details as she walked between the kitchen and the storage houses. A cluster of nightshade growing near a fence, foxglove flowers blooming beside a narrow forest trail. Even the faint smell of crushed hemlock along the riverbank now carried meaning. Each plant was a reminder that power could exist in places the masters never bothered to look. But with that understanding came a growing tension. The workers who had learned Eleanor's lessons were beginning to face a difficult question. Knowledge had changed how they viewed their world, but it had also placed responsibility on their shoulders. What should they do with what they knew? The answer was not simple. Some believed the knowledge should remain a secret tool of protection. They argued that the most important purpose of these lessons was survival. If someone became ill, they could identify dangerous plants and avoid them. If an overseer tried to accuse them of wrongdoing involving herbs or food, they would understand how to defend themselves. Others saw the knowledge differently. For them, the poison garden represented something far more powerful than simple education. It represented possibility. Daniel was among those who believed the knowledge might eventually be used to challenge the cruelty of the plantation system itself. But even he understood that such actions carried enormous risks. The overseers were always watching, and the punishment for suspected rebellion could be severe. So the discussions continued quietly among the workers. Late at night, after long days in the fields, small groups sometimes gathered in the shadows near their quarters. Their voices remained low, careful not to carry too far. They spoke about the plants they had studied, the symptoms they had learned to recognize, and the stories they had heard about mysterious illnesses affecting plantation owners in other regions. But they also spoke about fear. The system they lived under was designed to crush resistance before it could even begin. Overseers like Thomas Grady had spent years building their reputations on harsh discipline and constant surveillance. They believed fear was the only way to maintain control over the workers, and in many ways that belief had worked for generations. Yet the quiet revolution of knowledge was changing the psychology of the plantation. Workers who once felt powerless now carried secret understanding in their minds. Even if they never acted on it, that knowledge alone altered the balance of power. Grady, however, sensed that something was shifting. Though he could not identify the exact cause, the overseer had begun to notice small changes in the behavior of the workers. They were still obedient in the fields, but their silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of submission. Instead, it seemed thoughtful, almost watchful. To a man like Grady, who had built his authority on intimidation, this kind of silence was unsettling. He responded the only way he knew how, by tightening control. In the weeks that followed, Grady increased his patrols even further. He rode through the plantation at unpredictable hours, appearing suddenly in places where workers had once felt briefly out of sight. He inspected storage buildings and kitchens more frequently, looking for signs of stolen supplies or unusual activity. He even began questioning workers individually, demanding to know what they talked about during their evenings. Most of the workers responded with cautious, simple answers. They spoke about family, exhaustion, or ordinary daily concerns. Nothing they said revealed the deeper conversations that had been quietly unfolding among them. Still, Grady's suspicion continued to grow. One afternoon, while inspecting the small gardens behind the workers' quarters, he noticed something unusual. Several plants growing there did not belong to the vegetables typically cultivated for food. They were wild herbs. Grady crouched down and examined the leaves carefully. Though he was not particularly knowledgeable about plants, he recognized that some of them did not look familiar. "Who planted these?" he demanded, calling several workers closer. The men and women nearby exchanged nervous glances. Finally, an older worker stepped forward. "Just weeds, sir," he said calmly. "They grow on their own." Grady narrowed his eyes. The explanation seemed reasonable enough. Wild plants often appeared in gardens without anyone intentionally planting them. Still, the overseer remained uneasy. He ordered the workers to remove every unfamiliar plant from the garden. The workers obeyed immediately, pulling the herbs from the soil and discarding them into a nearby fire. But as the flames consumed the leaves, Sarah and Daniel exchanged a brief glance. Grady had destroyed a few plants, but he had no idea how many more existed across the plantation, and more importantly, he had no idea how many people now recognized them. Later that night, the workers gathered again near the forest clearing where the poison garden lessons had first begun. Eleanor Whitmore stood quietly beside the familiar rows of plants, watching the group approach through the shadows. She could sense the tension among them even before anyone spoke. "Grady found herbs in the gardens today," Daniel explained. Eleanor listened carefully as they described the overseer's growing suspicion. She remained calm, though her expression grew thoughtful. "This was always a possibility," she said. Sarah looked worried. "If he continues searching, he may discover this place," she said, gesturing toward the poison garden. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes," she admitted, "that risk has always existed." For a long moment, the group stood silently among the plants that had changed their lives. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "Knowledge is powerful," she said quietly, "but power always attracts attention eventually." Her words carried a weight the group could feel deeply. The poison garden had begun as a hidden sanctuary for learning, but now the plantation itself was beginning to sense the quiet transformation taking place beneath its surface. The overseers did not yet understand what was happening, but the tension between control and knowledge was growing stronger with each passing day, and as the workers looked around the small clearing, at the plants they had studied, the lessons they had shared, and the understanding they now carried, they realized something important. Even if the garden disappeared tomorrow, the knowledge would remain. It lived in their memories now, and once knowledge reaches enough minds, it becomes something far more difficult to destroy. Ashwood Plantation was beginning to feel the first tremors of a change that had started quietly with a widow, a garden, and a few curious students. A whisper had become a movement. And though no one could yet predict exactly how that movement would unfold, one thing was certain: the plantation's future would never again be as simple or predictable as the masters believed. Because beneath the surface of everyday life, a silent revolution had already begun. The tension that had slowly built across Ashwood Plantation now lingered like a heavy fog over every corner of the land. The fields still stretched endlessly beneath the hot sun, rows of cotton swaying quietly in the wind, just as they had for decades. The overseers still rode their horses across the plantation with the same stern authority. The mansion still stood tall at the center of the property, its white columns glowing faintly under the moonlight each night. To an outsider, nothing seemed to have changed, but inside the hearts and minds of the people who lived and worked there, everything was different. The poison garden had done far more than teach a handful of enslaved workers how to recognize dangerous plants. It had reshaped how they understood the world around them. The lessons Eleanor Whitmore had quietly shared had planted something deeper than knowledge. It had planted awareness, and awareness could never be erased as easily as a garden. Even after the overseer Thomas Grady ordered wild herbs removed from the workers' gardens, the understanding those plants represented remained alive. The workers still walked through the plantation fields each day, but now they noticed the hidden landscape around them in ways they never had before. What once appeared to be ordinary weeds now carried meaning. Every leaf, every root, every flower had become part of a secret language that only a few people on the plantation understood. Sarah felt this transformation strongly as the weeks passed. Each morning she woke before dawn, just as she always had, and reported to the mansion kitchen to begin the long day of cooking and cleaning. From the outside, her routine looked identical to the routine she had followed for years, but inside her mind she carried something new. Knowledge had given her a sense of awareness that changed the way she viewed the plantation. She no longer saw herself only as someone forced to serve the household. She saw herself as a person who understood forces that the masters themselves had never bothered to learn about. The land surrounding the plantation had become a quiet teacher, and the lessons were still spreading. Daniel noticed the same change in the fields. Workers who had once moved through their tasks with silent resignation now sometimes exchanged small, knowing glances when they passed certain plants growing along the edges of the land. These moments were subtle and brief, but they carried meaning. It was as if a hidden conversation had begun across the plantation, a conversation the overseers could not hear. Thomas Grady, however, continued to sense that something was not right. The overseer had spent years relying on fear to maintain control, and he had grown skilled at noticing even small shifts in behavior among the workers. The silence he now observed felt different. It was not the silence of exhaustion or submission. It was thoughtful, watchful. Though he still could not identify any specific act of rebellion, Grady began tightening his grip on the plantation once again. He increased the number of nighttime patrols and questioned workers more frequently about their activities after dark, but the knowledge spreading among the workers was not something he could easily find. It existed quietly within their minds, and because of that, it moved in ways that were impossible to track. Eleanor Whitmore watched these changes with careful attention. She understood better than anyone else what had begun months earlier when she first decided to transform her kitchen herbs into tools of education. At the time, she had only intended to share knowledge she believed people deserved to have, but knowledge, once released into the world, often grows in ways its teacher cannot control. Now the poison garden had become something much larger than a private experiment. It had become a symbol. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees and the plantation prepared for another quiet night, Eleanor walked slowly toward the forest clearing where the garden still grew. The small rows of plants remained untouched for now, though she knew it was only a matter of time before someone like Grady eventually discovered the hidden space. Sarah and Daniel were already waiting there when she arrived. For a moment, the three of them simply stood together among the plants that had changed so many lives. "This place began as a lesson," Eleanor said softly. Sarah looked around at the leaves and flowers glowing faintly in the fading light. "It became more than that," she replied. Daniel nodded. "It became hope." Eleanor smiled slightly at his words. Hope was not something plantations were designed to create. The entire system depended on keeping enslaved people convinced that their situation could never change. Fear and hopelessness were powerful tools of control, but knowledge could challenge that control in subtle ways. Even if no one ever used the poisonous plants growing in the garden for revenge or resistance, the simple fact that the workers now understood their power had already shifted something important. It had reminded them that the masters were not all-knowing. The plantation system depended on a carefully maintained illusion that the people in charge held complete authority over the land and everyone on it, but the poison garden had quietly shattered that illusion. Because the workers now knew something the masters did not, the land itself held secrets. And those secrets did not belong to the plantation owners. Over the next several weeks, Eleanor made a difficult decision. The lessons in the forest clearing slowly came to an end, not because the knowledge had lost its value, but because it had already accomplished its purpose. The workers who had attended the lessons had memorized what they needed to know. Continuing to gather in one place would only increase the risk of discovery, so the poison garden gradually returned to silence. The plants still grew beneath the trees, but fewer people visited the clearing. The knowledge had already moved beyond it. Months later, life on Ashwood Plantation continued much as it always had. The cotton harvests came and went. New workers arrived from nearby plantations while others disappeared, sold to distant owners whose names the remaining workers might never hear again. Yet among those who had once gathered in the forest, the lessons of the poison garden remained vivid. Sometimes Sarah would pass Daniel in the fields and notice him studying the wild plants along the fence line. Sometimes an older worker would quietly warn a younger one not to touch a certain berry or leaf. The knowledge had become part of the community, and because it lived within people rather than in a single hidden garden, it could travel far beyond the boundaries of Ashwood. Years later, long after the quiet lessons had ended, travelers passing through nearby plantations occasionally spoke of strange stories. Some told tales of enslaved cooks who understood plants better than doctors. Others spoke about mysterious illnesses among certain cruel overseers or masters, illnesses that no one could fully explain. Whether these stories were true or simply rumors carried from place to place did not really matter. What mattered was the idea behind them, the idea that knowledge, especially knowledge shared quietly among oppressed people, could reshape the balance of power in ways history often failed to record. The poison garden at Ashwood Plantation might never appear in official records. No documents would likely describe the lessons Eleanor Whitmore gave beneath the trees. No plantation ledger would mention the quiet gatherings where enslaved workers studied the chemistry hidden inside common plants. But history is not only written in books. Sometimes it lives in whispers passed between generations. Sometimes it survives in the memories of people who refuse to forget what they had learned. And sometimes the most powerful revolutions are the ones that begin not with weapons or armies, but with knowledge shared quietly in the shadows. If you found this story powerful and thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you never miss our next hidden history documentary, and leave a comment below telling us how much this story fascinated you. And remember, many of history's most important stories were never meant to be told, but together we can make sure they are never forgotten.